Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Rutkoff. I'm the executive editor of Bloomberg Green, print issue of Bloomberg Green magazine. It came out in June, and it marked the first collection of the work we've done since our launch in January this year. Before we begin the program, I want to do a few housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, HP, JLL, and Iberdrola, for helping make this event possible. I want to bring Lucas on now. If you could talk to us about the decision you made today and the investment and how you came to decide who would be on the receiving end of the first funding.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Thanks for having me as part of the event, and kudos on the launch of Bloomberg Green. It's become pretty daily reading for me. So thanks for all that. To put in context the news that we announced today, back in January, as you guys covered, Microsoft made a commitment to be carbon negative by 2030. And we can get into the broader details of that. But really, it was to reduce our emissions by half or more, to remove the rest, to go back in time and remove all of the emissions that we've been associated with historically since Microsoft was founded in 1975, and to invest $1 billion in principally in carbon reduction and removal technologies to help pave the way for scale in achieving our climate commitments. Today, this morning, actually just a few minutes ago, we released a new blog outdating 7 concrete steps of progress that we've made since our January announcement. And one of them has to do with the initial investments that we're making through our Climate Innovation Fund, this $1 billion fund. And specifically, that first investment is with Energy Impact Partners, a leading venture capital firm in investing really in the decentralization and decarbonization of the energy and the transportation sectors, the two sectors that make up the majority of our overall global emissions portfolio. We're investing $50 million with EIP and are really excited about the way that money will get put to use as part of that broader fund strategy.
So can you explain to me how Microsoft builds this ecosystem of both creating funding for carbon negative technologies and taxing your
Sure. So the way I think about it really, I have two mechanisms, two levers I can pull. I have a carbon fee internally. Microsoft has a carbon fee. We're one of the first companies to do so. It's not just a shadow price applied for planning. It's actual a fee that's calculated and budgeted for. And I have a fund, this investment fund that we just talked about, this Climate Innovation Fund. And we can use those two financial mechanisms together because the investment fund allows us to make external investments in projects, programs, technologies outside of our four walls. And our fee raises, a fund internally that we can use to become a customer of carbon reduction and removal technologies. And we work those two things together to try to make sure that the market grows as much as possible and the price reduces as much as possible. And so even though our commitment to become carbon negative that we announced in January isn't until 2030, we're not waiting to get started. That's a lot of the news that we announced today. One of the other aspects, one of the other 7 updates that we announced today is actually the release of a new call for proposals where Microsoft will be looking to procure 1 million metric tons of CO2 removal in the coming year. And so, I think as part of this announcement, you can see we're actively investing and we're actively purchasing at the same time, and being able to operate in the market as both an investor and as a consumer is a really critical step. I think in the Bloomberg Green piece on Microsoft's commitments, we talked about how markets don't just work because you wish they worked; they work because we make them work, and that's really what we're trying to do with both sides of our financial investments in the carbon space.
So I want to get back to that RFP in a second, but talking about markets, one of the most aggressive parts of Microsoft's plan is to bring the price of carbon removal down to $20 per metric ton, which is, a far, far below what most things cost today. Can you talk about how you expect that to develop? Is it through the invention of new technologies that don't exist? Are you going to be relying on natural carbon offsets that have a lower price? How do you expect to move the market in the direction that you're looking for?
So I think I think the carbon removal markets are going to remain a healthy mix of nature-based solutions, afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, as well as more engineered solutions, things like direct air capture or BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. We'll be working across all of that technology stack, those nets or negative emissions technologies, looking to develop the market. One of the things that makes the price come down is when supply goes way up. And so we're working with partners to ensure that supply goes up. Supply doesn't go up unless there's people willing to purchase. And so that's what makes our RFP so important in my mind. But simply a desire to purchase doesn't necessarily bring down the fundamental cost, where there needs to be additional kind of net new investment in the business itself. That's where climate innovation comes in. Look, this $20 price on carbon, you can call it aspirational, but I do think that it's representative of the aspiration that the world needs to have on the cost of mitigating our climate crisis. Because when you look at the prices today, you can see that they're just way too high for the world to take on. They might not be too high for the Microsofts or some of these other organizations to take on, but they're too high for everybody else. And so it's incumbent, I believe, on Microsoft and other players in this space to ensure that we don't just engage in these markets for ourselves. We engage in these markets on behalf of the world. And to do that, we need to be laser focused on increasing supply and decreasing price.
To the limitations of even a very powerful company like Microsoft, who's putting $1 billion into these investments. I mean, in some ways, $1 billion is an astronomical sum of money, but in the scope of the problem, it's really not very much. So is part of this a absence of or a limitation or lack of government funding to move the markets in the direction that you're trying to push them? Is that part of what's holding this solution space back?
$1 billion, you said it perfectly. $1 billion is a lot and nothing at the same time. It's a lot for any particular institution, organization to mobilize in the climate space. But it's really nothing compared to the grand total cost that we know we're going to have to bear to meet a 1.5 future. But I would just preface that with one more thing, which is that the cost that we will have to pay is, again, nothing when compared to the price that we will end up paying if we don't invest in stabilizing our climate systems. And so you asked about government policy. Of course, we need government policy in this space. Government policy in many ways is what can kickstart markets. And one of the problems that we have in the carbon market is that there isn't a requirement to play in it. And so without a price on carbon, without here in the United States, at least a price on carbon or a national cap and trade system or some sort of regulatory system that incentivizes the markets, we have a bit of a chicken or egg problem, which is that we have a waste stream, right? CO2 is simply just waste that we emit, unfortunately, into the atmosphere with catastrophic consequences. There's no price to emitting that waste. There's no cost to that. And because of that, we have a really difficult time. We have voluntary players like Microsoft in this space. We have others, but we would benefit significantly from seeing additional investment, both in or additional action in the policy and regulatory space, but also in the investment space. Because negative emission technologies, whether that's being able to use, embrace technology solutions to scale nature-based solutions like remote sensing for estimating soil carbon capture, or soil carbon sequestration potential, all the way up to pure engineered solutions like direct air capture. We need additional applied research funding. I think there's a lot of basic research going on. There's a lot of voluntary buyers right now. It's the applied research funding that I really think is going to shrink that supply and demand gap.
So I want to go back to something you were talking about in terms of there not being policies or regulations that tax emissions in the United States, that there's no force stopping it. One of the things that often gets brought up in these discussions, it's clear Microsoft is doing an extraordinary amount to eliminate its emissions, but at the same time, you still do business with fossil fuel companies, who use Microsoft products as part of their operations. So is there some sense in which Microsoft is fighting against itself by continuing to help companies that are creating these unchecked emissions?
Well, I think we're actually fighting for everybody. I think if you look at the approach that we've taken, we're much more of a carrot than a stick company. And what we are looking to do is to create a level playing field. And when a company like Microsoft is out there picking winners and losers in the market, that doesn't necessarily produce a scalable solution. So it's why we are out there advocating for action on the regulatory front so that everybody has to play in the same space. It's why we're also in conversations with with all of our energy sector customers about the transformation that we need to see happen. And fundamentally, we do need all of the energy sector organizations and corporations to transform themselves and their industry. We think that the easiest way, the fastest way, and the most beneficial way to society is to do that together. We don't think that walking away solves anybody's problems.
We've seen at some of the big tech companies like Amazon, there have been employees who are advocating for more aggressive climate postures. Do you have to deal with that at Microsoft as a result of the relationship with fossil fuel companies?
Well, one of the things I think about is interesting about the tech sector in general and Microsoft in particular is just how empowered our employees are to make their voices heard. Sustainability and climate change is one of the, if not the top concern that we hear about. Although, again, I would say that maybe that's observer bias, being the chief environmental officer. Of course, you're going to hear about employee concerns. And yes, of course, there's interest across a diversity of opinions in our employee community. Our employee community represents, in large part, I think, the spread of opinions that we have here in the U.S. and global society on this topic. And so we listen to all of them. We give folks options about what they work on, and we take on board their concerns and their proposed solutions for what we might be able to do. But like I said, we also have a broader perspective on the energy industry, a broader perspective on where it needs to go if the world's going to meet its goals, if Microsoft's going to meet its goals, and if some of those companies that have goals of their own are going to meet those as well. We think digital technology plays a critical role in the future energy sector transformation, and that's what we want to be part of.
So I'd like to ask you now talking about the RFP that you've put out today, looking for people to sell these either offsets or negative emissions. What does a successful response to that request look like? What are you looking for when you're buying either these engineered solutions or natural solutions?
Well, we're looking for a few things. First and foremost, we're looking for proved carbon removal. We're looking for negative carbon outcomes as part of this. We're also looking to ensure that these projects are additional, i.e. that they would not have happened in the absence of our purchasing. This is a relatively new term that you'll see Microsoft pushing on quite a bit. We're looking to ensure that these projects are durable. And by that, we mean that the emissions that are being captured and sequestered today or in the year that we are in the year that we are making that investment will be locked away for a long enough time to make a material, at least a long enough time, if not an infinitely long enough time, to ensure that they make a material difference to mitigating our climate challenge. And then we're also looking for evidence that these investments won't lead to leakage, i.e. these investments won't simply take one thing off the board here, but put something on the board somewhere else. And so, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that these investments remove carbon, they're scientifically verified, but we are also looking to spur innovation in this space. So we're open to proposals that may not be specifically internationally certified today, but might have a compelling path towards that certification moving forward. And then, in particular, we're looking for a few additional opportunities if they're available. One is there a role for technology to play in scaling the approach that any particular project we may invest in is taking more globally? And is there a evidence that these investments are in line with the requirements that we know are necessary, things like environmental equity and climate justice, we know are necessary to ensure that the transformation towards a net zero carbon economy by 2050 that the world needs to go through, to ensure that that's a just and equitable transformation. So look, there's a whole lot of things that we're looking for. First and foremost, we're looking for carbon removed from the atmosphere. We're looking to ensure that that's because of the investments we're making, that carbon will remain there and that it won't cause adverse harm elsewhere. If we can ensure some of these additional attributes, that's fantastic as well.
It sounds like there's a bit of dissatisfaction in your view in the way that natural offsets are verified right now, that it falls short of a tech standard of verification. Is that the case? I mean, do you feel that there's a risk right now with some of the investments in offsets that we don't actually know whether the tree remains standing or the forest is protected in the long term?
Yeah, that's one aspect of the risk. The other aspect of the certification process is just the scalability of it all, right? And I think technology can play a role on both sides, because right now the overhead required to do carbon removal certification is a pretty significant fraction of the overall operating cost of a carbon removal project. So I think technology can drastically scale that up. I also think that technology has the potential to drastically scale up our quality and assurance. Our after the investment fact checking to make sure that the sequestration is happening as it was promised and as it was contracted. There's a lot of work to be done there. Some of this is basic research. Some of this is basic, machine learning meets remote sensing. Some of it is on the ground in the soil sensor technology and data collection. And in my mind, nearly all of it comes together in cloud-based platforms that allow the world to approach carbon markets and carbon removal markets with the level of transparency that it deserves.
While we're on the topic of markets, I want to bring in an audience question. There's a question as to whether you'll be involved in carbon trading or auctioning platforms. Will there be that aspect of a market dynamic in the way that you're working carbon removal for Microsoft?
I wouldn't say yes or no to any market that we may ever get into. I think that those are important. They're obviously markets that we hear frequently from customers about that they are interested in. So I would say, as and when we have more to say in that space, we'll definitely let everybody know. But I think that spirit is that I already voiced is probably the most important thing to take away, which is that we need to take a very broad view on what's necessary and the role that a company like Microsoft might be able to play or should play. And I think the world's going to have to go on that learning journey with us about what makes sense for a Microsoft to get involved in, where we're a partner, where we're an investor, where we are a provider, or where we're a customer. And the deeper we get into the global challenges here, the more sharp our perspective on this becomes. But that'll continue to evolve over the coming months and quite frankly, years.
So if we're looking at some of the technology areas you're investing in, I think we've heard you mention on the call today direct air capture and carbon capture and storage. I think you also mentioned at one point. And we've talked, some of your answers have dealt with forestation projects. Are there any areas that you have ruled out for investment because you just don't think it's workable, or you don't like the current economics of it and you don't think they're eligible to change? If you're looking at kind of the field of emissions removal right now, are there things you're not interested in?
Yeah, well, I think that, we're not interested in what we had been doing previously, which is avoided emissions investments. That's not to say that the world shouldn't be doing those. I think they're important investments in the carbon offset market. And we did that for almost a decade. But we think that carbon removal is where the markets need to be kind of kick-started. And so that's where we're going. In the carbon removal markets, I think that there's still a lot of playing out to be had about which technologies are beneficial and viable. I would say that, just personally, I'm a little less excited about approaches where the carbon accounting is extremely complicated. Because just the number of steps in the chain that have to be verified and validated just makes the accounting systems a lot harder. And we already are behind the curve on carbon accounting already. So, I wouldn't say I would rule anything out. I'm not crazy about, large scale geoengineering. I don't think you're going to see us, investing in some of the more out there geoengineering technologies. I think that we have plenty to do and plenty of opportunity in the more standard opportunity basket that we're talking about in the RFP.
That's super interesting. One of the questions people are asking in particular about the RFP right now in the question and answer space is there a way to, like, if they go to Microsoft's blog post today, is there a form where people can apply? And do you have to have any kind of, meet some kind of criteria other than having a plan that appeals to you? Are you looking for some kind of credential, or do you have to be an academic? What sort of standing do you have to have in order to be someone who approaches Microsoft?
So the RFP will be actually sent out tomorrow to a long list of organizations that we've been cultivating over the past 6 months. Interested organizations can be in contact with us about, and we'll receive kind of a welcome pack with our guidance, documentation, etc. I think one of the things that was important about what we're committing to here is we're going to be transparent. We're going to actually publish all of the proposals that we got, minus confidential information. We're going to publish our guidance document. We're going to publish what we end up investing in, what we didn't invest in, because there's not a lot of transparency in the carbon removal markets today. And we really want to show the world what the market actually looks like, which many people don't know. And there's one final thing that I would just say about this transparency bit, and this commitment to moving forward today, as opposed to waiting till 2030 to figure out how we're going to meet our 2030 goals, is that we're not the only company thinking about this. One of the last bits of news, and one of the main bits of news that I'm really excited about that we announced earlier this morning, is a new coalition that Microsoft and 8 other companies came together called the Transform to Net Zero Coalition. And it's a coalition of companies that are leading the way to net zero or negative goals that are beyond commitment setting and are really firmly in the commitment implementation phase and focusing on putting together the best practice, the business integration guidebooks and frameworks to share with companies all around the world that are looking to either figure out how to achieve the commitments that they just made or how to make commitments in the absence of an organizational roadmap. And so we're working with companies like Unilever and Starbucks and Wipro and Nike and Danone and Natura and Mercedes-Benz and Maersk, with a founding NGO partner, EDF, and we're in good hands with a secretariat being run by BSR to really come together as a group of companies that have that board and CEO and senior leadership buy-in to really go and invest and transform our organizations to help not just, do that for ourselves and share best practices amongst ourselves, but to share that with the rest of the world as well. That's really the number one question we get from customers and non-customers, but just, companies getting in touch. The number one question is, well, how are you doing it inside of your organization? And I know that's a top customer question from the other members of the Net Zero Coalition. And so I think we have a lot to add actually by showing the world that this isn't just possible. It's actually good for business, because I think if you look at those companies, there are a set of companies that are doing quite well generally as well.
I can tell you just from seeing the questions in the chat here that people already want to know where they can go to find the information that you'll be putting out in terms of transparency of what the coalition or what Microsoft thinks of as successful approaches to carbon removal. I want to ask you one last question before we close. In our profile of you that was in the first issue of Bloomberg Green by a veteran Microsoft reporter, Dita Bass, it was very clear that you have like a big appetite for risk. There was a whole discussion in the beginning of your comfort with risk and the fact that you're often injured from the sports that you play. And I wanted to know if you see any risks in the approach that you're taking with Microsoft. I mean, we're very. I think it's very interesting to think of climate solutions from a tech lens, but sometimes a tech mindset can lead into difficult directions. Do you think there's any risks with taking a tech-focused approach to a problem like climate change?
Well, look, I mean, any risk-averse solution is not one that's likely to lead to significant impacts down the line. I think I wouldn't say I have a healthy appetite for risk. I say that I have a healthy appetite for tackling solutions and integrating risk into the overall decision framework for how to do that. I think from a climate perspective, we have been exceptionally risk adverse in the short term and exceptionally risk okay with risk in the long term. I mean, we wouldn't be in this situation if the risk that destabilizing our climate system presents is astronomical. Yet somehow, when you try to do something about it, people say, "Oh, hey, you must have a high appetite for risk," right? I'm like, no, I have a low appetite for risk. I'm trying to avoid the future risk. I'm okay. I'm okay taking a little risk now. I am not afraid of swinging and missing. As long as we're out there swinging, we're going to hit some, right? And the more you swing, the better you get. Is technology the silver bullet to solving our climate challenges? Absolutely not. Is technology an underinvested in area as an important tool in the broader solution portfolio of getting ahead of these existential challenges? Absolutely. And so all I'm here to do is to say that Microsoft and the broader tech sector, we have a role to play. We're not the only players, but I do think it's time that we do our part.
Well, Lucas, thank you so much for being here today and for telling us about Microsoft plans. It was fascinating, and I'm really glad you could be here. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And now I'm going to introduce my colleague from Bloomberg Green, editor Jillian Goodman. She put together the stimulus guide that was a huge part of our first issue, and she's going to be doing the next session about climate justice. So over to you, Jillian.
Thank you very much, Erin. Joining me is Rihana Gunn-Wright from the Roosevelt Institute. Rihana, are you there?
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Hi, it's so nice to actually see you. We got a chance to chat the other day, but didn't get the visual, so it's very nice to have the face-to-face. I wanted to get started just with a simple definition of terms. So the conversation around climate justice can seem very broad. You know, we're talking about everything from international diplomacy and managing sea level rise to like factory siting and police violence, even. So, when you talk about climate justice, what do you mean?
So when I talk about climate justice, like when a lot of people talk about climate justice, it's about, I think, three things in particular. The first is about access to a healthy environment for everyone equally, right? We know that people of color, particularly Black, Latino, and Native populations are far more likely to live near toxic pollution, to have not clean drinking water, to have polluted air. And it's similar in some rural communities, too, with issues with agricultural runoff. And so climate justice starts from that place, that everyone should have access to the same climate that allows them to live healthy, dignified lives. The second thing I would say is an acknowledgement that climate is far broader than the way that we talk about it, which is really funny because if you think of society as a body, then energy is our food, and sort of climate is the thing that we need to survive. It's incredibly broad. But often we only talk, at least when I was growing up, mainstream environmentalism was largely about the Arctic, about conservation, about natural resources. And climate justice acknowledges that, like, our built environment is also part of our environment, and that climate means the physical conditions that you need to live a healthy and whole life. And so that means, like we said, is there lead in your home? Is there lead in your water? Do you have clean air? And also, I think something that climate justice activists have been talking about for a long time is that problems, say like police brutality, are not separate from the effects of climate change and of pollution in these communities. They're all experienced as part of the environment that in lots of ways decides if you live or die. And then the third part of climate justice is a recognition that climate isn't a technical problem. The climate crisis is not purely a matter of reducing emissions, but we have to acknowledge that the reason that we're in the climate crisis and what we see is a result of our economic and social system. So just an acknowledgement that that the things that we're seeing are driven by the way that we have structured our economy and society, and thus the things that we need to do to address climate change will likely be a lot broader and deeper than we usually talk about or acknowledge that it will be.
Mm-hmm. So you were, of course, one of the architects of the Green New Deal, and a lot of these ideas were incorporated into that document. And that was, we started talking about this more broadly as a society a couple of years ago, and it was very controversial from the perspective of today. That seems almost quaint, like a lot of these ideas have become not quite mainstream, but at least, discussed in the mainstream. Like we saw last week, Joe Biden released not just a climate plan, but a separate incorporated climate justice plan. And so I wanted to ask you about that. How close did that come to, I guess, accomplishing what you think needs to be accomplished as far as pursuing and achieving climate justice?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Biden plans had some really good things in them, right? There's 40% of money going to frontline communities, right? 40% of those investments going into frontline communities, committing to carbon-free electricity by 2035, is another one. Setting up an office in DOJ that is specifically about environmental injustice. Those are really important interventions, especially when you're talking about things like, say, Cancer Alley, right? Communities that have been fighting legal fights for decades, in some cases, for years on end, and not making any progress. So like something like an environmental justice part of DOJ could go a long way to doing that. And I think that is an example of one of the really important things about the Green New Deal is about the Green New Deal is both about, of course, reducing emissions, but because we see the climate crisis as the effect of economic and social systems, it's also about changing power relationships, right? One of the fundamental arguments from climate justice activists, and to some extent, the Green New Deal, is an acknowledgement that like the ability to use fossil fuels without restrictions requires people who are seen as disposable, right? Because when you are burning fossil fuels, say at a peaker plant, right, or at a refinery, that produces a lot of pollution. And so as long as there are people who are disposable, there's always essentially a place to do that. And so when you think about the effect of power, say at the Dakota Access Pipeline, essentially that was first supposed to go through Bismarck. The residents of Bismarck got that pipeline redirected through like a series of community town hall meetings. When you think about that compared to what Native activists had to do at Standing Rock, you see what it means, what power means, and what is possible when communities have power. Same thing in Cancer Alley, like I talked about. The one community that did get addressed was a white community, right? Again, we're talking about issues of power. And so any plan has to not just reduce emissions, but truly think about how are we empowering people of color, right? How are we empowering and creating opportunities to build power for wealth, for ownership, for political power in communities that have been marginalized? Because when you think about it, that is one of our best buffers against further degradation of our environment. And so that is really crucial, that ability to move power. And that is a matter of top line policies like 40% to frontline communities, but it's also a matter of downstream effects, right? Will people's taxes go up when they upgrade their homes? There's been, I know of at least one story of a community group, right, that remediated someone's home. She almost lost it because her taxes went up because her home value went up, right? Can the right small community organizations, can they compete for federal grants, right? If we're providing money through federal grants, when people are getting resettled, how are we dealing with the impact of redlining on the value of their home? How will they move if their home is so devalued that they can't buy a home in another place, right? And they have to retreat from the place where they're living. So all of that is involved, I think, in good climate policy. So I think the Biden plan is a step, and I'm sure they're probably thinking about some other things as well. But I think ultimately the Green New Deal was about addressing the climate crisis in a particular way, which is a way that both creates millions of good jobs, right? That redresses environmental injustice, but all with a goal of righting power relationships from the sort of extreme distribution that we have right now.
So a lot of that, when we talk about plans that are comprehensive and systemic, a lot of times the conversation sort of runs aground on this notion of political will. Like, we can't get this done. It's too big. How will we ever get everyone to agree on all these policies at the same time? You talked a little bit about this in an interview with the MIT Technology Review last month, and I just want to, read you, everybody, a quote from that. You said people were nervous that attaching climate change and climate policy to calls for racial justice or economic justice was too much, that we were actually going to make it harder to make promise on climate, as if they aren't all connected, which they are. And so we've seen, in the first issue of the Green magazine, we did a lot of, reporting and writing about green stimulus, and even talking to some climate activists, climate advocates. We heard some of this same attitude about stimulus funding for green projects. Like, we don't want to do it all at once. It would be, it would be crass. Like, let's attack the health side of this problem first, and then move on to climate. But that seems to be sort of anathema to the ideas that are embodied in the Green New Deal and the idea of climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, they are anathema. I actually experienced this in my own work. There were a lot of conversations I was involved in around COVID stimulus. It was like, should we mention climate? Should we push for climate protections in this bill? And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's insensitive. And I always thought that was very interesting, because if you pause and think about it, what folks are really saying in that is, besides, we want to respect, right, the immense loss that's happening, and not seem as though we're trying to use this as a political opportunity when hundreds, over at this point, 150,000 people have died. That is a huge loss, and we have to sit with that and allow space for people to grieve. And I understood that, but there was also an element of that I felt that was unspoken, which was that we are still thinking of climate and environment as a white issue, right? Because especially in the context of the uprisings, I heard the same thing. We can't bring climate in here, which was really interesting, because essentially you're saying we want to center Black voices in a Black struggle, and climate is too white to bring into that conversation, which is, anathema to what Black activists, both around police brutality and around climate, have been talking about. And that's because, one, a lot of times those are the same activists, because, like I said, police brutality and toxic pollution exists in the same communities. I'm from a community that's likely a frontline community. And, one of the things that I experienced, I got asthma because of elevated pollution around my home, but I was also incredibly terrified of police my whole life, right? That's not different. Those things aren't different. And in fact, if we're actually listening to people of color, including Movement for Black Lives, and the NAACP, people who have direct, the NAACP has a climate justice and environmental justice program for a reason. And so I think that we just have to sit with that and recognize, like, why do we think that this isn't the right thing to bring into this moment? And then the second thing is that, I think a lot of times on even the level of the problems that we're facing, that also doesn't make sense, because COVID happened, one, partially as a result of some of the economic systems that drive climate change, right? There's some thoughts about the way factory farming allows viruses like this to sort of change themselves more frequently, and we're having more outbreaks. So that's part of it, but it's also happening in the context of ongoing environmental injustice and climate change. So thinking about right now, right, toxic pollution, we know, is one of the reasons that Black people are dying at double the rates from COVID, right? There's already a study showing that correlation. And when it first happened, you can basically map frontline communities with COVID hotspots. And so this idea that these things are happening in two separate vacuums isn't true. At the same time, as like one of the reasons that we couldn't manage COVID, and possibly that rates were so high in those communities where people were too poor to stop going to work when they needed to stop going to work, right? So all of these things are happening at the same time, and trying to act as though they aren't happening at the same time both doesn't allow us to attack the problems and the sort of system that is the systems that are creating the problems effectively. It hinders us from doing that. And I think the other really interesting thing about that is, like the last speaker said, the cost of doing nothing about climate, of destabilizing our climate, is astronomical, right? We literally don't know and cannot comprehend all of what is going to happen. And so this idea that politics, like we have to live in the political reality, actually sort of misplaces what we actually have control over. We have control over our system, over our institutions, right? We have control over our politics. That's the thing we have the most control over. We don't have control over climate systems. We don't have control over the emissions that we have already released that are already affecting us. And so to say that our politics is the thing that sort of is most in the way, I just have a hard time thinking that. I mean, the Earth is 5-0 in the extinction game. She has never lost, right? So to think that it is easier to somehow figure out how to suck carbon out of the air, or right to deal with this in ways that don't require any sort of change in our political system, or largely allow us to keep doing business as usual, I think is a deep misunderstanding of what we can do and what we can't do. And what we need, what we actually have the most control over to lead us to good climate policy, and what we don't have control over, which is managing all of the fallout that will come if we don't actually do what is necessary to reduce emissions and to decrease temperature rise within the time frame that we have.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from the audience about how capital could best be directed within urban communities to address climate priorities. I know we talked about, the Biden proposal, which proposes to direct 40% of that funding to urban communities. But what sort of projects should we be expecting? Should we be looking for?
Well, I mean, the projects that I think people will see most in urban communities out of the Biden plan, there's a lot of investment in buildings, energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings. I think you're going to see a lot of work around solar installations, residential solar. I think you're going to see a lot of some impacts with electric vehicles. And, there could be some changes in the ways that we sort of measure and deal with environmental justice. As far as what capital can do, I think that's an interesting question, because there is an issue with mismatch of capital. A lot of the groups that can do the most innovative work cannot take in the amount of capital that most people want to move. Right. So there's some efforts to essentially out of a couple of nonprofits in California to figure out a way to harmonize that, to make it possible for community orgs to take in large amounts of capital to do projects, particularly around buildings. But I think in the absence of that, thinking about the ways, one, that folks can support and work directly with environmental justice organizations and climate justice organizations, particularly ones that are already doing things like retrofitting buildings, teaching people how to weatherize homes, installing solar. There's Push Buffalo in New York, and Buffalo, New York does some of that. So there are opportunities for that. But then the other thing that I think is thinking about some of the sort of downstream aspects, say higher taxes if people do retrofits. I think an interesting model that some people are talking about in Buffalo is actually moving corporate money to, while these gaps exist, to fund things like, hey, if you improve your home, we'll handle the tax increase. There's a fund to handle the tax increase, right? There's a fund to handle those sorts of solutions that directly support people to do the things that we know we need to do to reduce emissions, while also giving them the direct support while the gaps in the overall sort of systems exist.
Mm-hmm. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to ask, when we talk about climate change, we talk about the systemic improvements needed to address climate change. I'm wondering whether you see a path to a carbon neutral society, one that is no longer causing these major catastrophic changes, that doesn't also lead to a more just society. Like, is there a way to still screw this up?
Yes, certainly. There's no
Immense
there's
capacity
no
to screw this up.
There's immense opportunities to screw this up. Well, I would say two things. I think not. I think it would have been more possible before we were in the place that we are today, which is where we just need sort of rapid and massive investments and rapid and massive change, right? I do think there was a scenario when, say, you could have done this largely and not well, I think, but you could have reduced emissions at least, period, through, say, some more technical mechanisms like a carbon tax. But one, we don't have the runway for that and have those things. Not that a carbon tax doesn't have a place, but those things alone, that's not really, I think, real to reduce emissions at the scale and as quickly as we need to. And then I think the second thing is it's not really a political reality anymore. I think because it's such a polarized issue. And I think what we saw with police reform and the uprisings is that it's really important, if you're going to move something that has no support on one side, you need big multiracial coalitions that can build power, that can put power in the streets. And that is very difficult to do if you are not talking about climate in a way that also creates a more just and whole society. Because we talk a lot about parts per million, et cetera, but the way that most people most people, period, experience climate change is economic and health loss, right? Those impacts. Will I lose my home? Will I lose my job? Right? Am I getting sick from this? Right? Am I getting sick from these pollutants? What's going to happen? And the fact is that I just think it's human nature. You cannot get someone to take a loss if you cannot either show how you'll replace the thing that they will lose, which in some cases is impossible, right? We also have to grasp that, climate crisis is here. There is some amount of loss that we just can't avoid. It's too, and we have to accept that. And so if you can't replace the thing, you have to be able to tell people, okay, you're going to experience a loss, but here's how I'm going to change the conditions so that loss creates as little harm as possible. Right? Other than that, you're going to have a very difficult time selling people on something that feels to them so far away, so slow moving, right. And that that people are really thinking about in terms of, they know this is going to change their world. They know going off fossil fuels will. So if we can't tell them and really create a plan for how we're going to make that transition and also hold and protect people the best that we can, then I don't know how you really have these conversations, particularly when you have a political party that's not sure it's a problem. And you also have companies with large amounts of money that are invested in not necessarily changing this on the scale or in the ways that we want.
Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately, but thank you so much for joining us. And I think we'll go to the next session, which is New Green Voices with Laura Zelenko.
At the end of 2017, we decided to take a hard look at the actual numbers, both in terms of our representation and our stories, but also on our TV programming and our radio programming. And the numbers really surprised us. About 10% of our outside guests that were brought onto TV were women.
I think we all can agree that the industry would be far better off for being more diverse.
What we heard from the bookers was that either they said that they couldn't find the women, there weren't women in the right roles that they were looking for, or if they found the woman didn't feel comfortable going on TV. And we thought the one thing that we could actually impact was this issue of the training. And we created an initiative called New Voices in 2018 to offer 4-hour one-on-one training for each woman that we brought in to give them some video experience, some feedback, to learn about their messaging.
This is what I would say. I think quarterly earnings, we all get extremely focused on. It's a really good training. And what I really learn is just understanding sometimes you may not want to answer that question and just being able to pivot to something else entirely and getting your point across.
Something that really impressed me about this initiative is that it is without any expectation and the program is fully confidential.
It's not necessary to go on Bloomberg TV after this. The idea is that you will be TV ready to voice your opinions, to share your perspective. The ultimate goal from a journalistic standpoint is that we have better programming, that we have more interesting conversations at events, and hearing opinions that we may not otherwise have voiced.
The only way to really achieve those goals is to have that representation within the financial news.
So we've more than doubled the percentage of women experts on our TV and radio to over 21%.
Why do you think tech executives are putting their money and their muscle behind this now? I see the difference when we have more female voices on our show. There are new ideas, new insights.
Anyone really who's looking to grow professionally in their career is a fantastic opportunity to take up.
Hi there. So I'm Laura Zelenko. I am a senior executive editor here at Bloomberg, and I'm very happy to say that this video is a bit dated. We've now reached 26% female representation on Bloomberg TV, and we're heading to 30% by year end, and then we're going to keep pushing beyond that. We have so far trained more than 180 women in 10 global cities who have appeared on Bloomberg TV more than 500 times, and even more on other media. And just yesterday, we launched a new cohort for new voices of Black executives in the US, both men and women. So today I'm excited to announce that we will be joining up with Bloomberg Green to ensure that we amplify the voices of underrepresented experts in the climate change and ESG space. 2 slots for each of our remaining cohorts this year will be reserved for experts in this field, and that includes Washington, D.C., Mumbai, Dubai, Singapore, Sydney, as well as our new cohort for Black executives in the U.S. And we will be extending that into next year and beyond as we keep growing this program. Now, there's no better way to promote this New Voices program than to speak to some of the participants and wonder, how were they not on our radar before? Well, they are very much on our radar now. So please welcome Melanie Nakagawa, who is the Director of Climate Strategy at Princefield Capital and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation at the U.S. State Department, as well as Marcelia Freeman, the Senior Vice President in Capital Development for ESG at EIG Partners. Thank you both for joining. And let me start with you, Melanie. Why don't you tell us about what you do?
Hi, great. Thank you so much, Laura. It's wonderful to be here and great to be part of the New Voices program. I'm the Director of Climate Strategy at Princefield Capital. We are a global growth stage technology-focused investment firm. We invest out of 2 funds. The first is Princefield Global. It is an internet software-focused fund, and then Princefield Climate Technology, which is focused on investing into climate-positive technology solutions. It's actually a really exciting time to be with Princefield Climate Technology. We closed that fund end of last year, so we're in the early stages of capital deployment and looking at incredible opportunities, incredible companies across the 6 core sectors that we're focused on. Those sectors are screened for both mitigation and adaptation opportunities. We were really keen when we established the fund to take a more holistic approach to addressing the climate challenge and looking at climate solutions. So we're looking at just not the mitigation ones, but also proactively screening into our pipeline those that address adaptation. So 6 core sectors that we are focused on are advanced mobility, industrial efficiency, precision agriculture, resilient health, smart cities, and smart grids. And these are all technologies and sectors that are being driven by really the exciting mega trends in technology that are happening today. This is AI, machine learning, data analytics, all of which is coming together to provide a nice tailwind of technology to those sectors, And then, of course, sitting in Washington, D.C., the policy component as well. There's incredible policy tailwinds to each of those sectors that we're investing behind. And so we're really excited to be thinking about opportunities there. And as a global firm with offices in Hong Kong, San Francisco, and Amsterdam, we really want to take that global approach to looking at all these different types of climate positive opportunities. So thanks again.
And Marcelia, why don't you let us give us a description of what you do at work?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. So I work at EIG Global Energy Partners. We are a 38-year-old firm that is a private investor kind of anywhere in the world, anywhere in the capital stack, and across the energy value chain. So from upstream through renewables. As you can imagine, ESG is incredibly important in a business like that. I sit in the capital development team, really managing relationships with investors, and raising capital. And then my secondary job is sitting on the ESG committee. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart. And as I kind of wrap up, I'll say your last speaker, Rihana Gunn-Wright, was amazing. And she did an incredibly great job of kind of talking about how climate change isn't about just the E, and how we can really incorporate it into all three pillars of ESG. So thank you.
Go back to you. And, as we expanded New Voices into Washington, I was a little bit concerned that we would have trouble finding folks in the financial industry because we don't provide this media training to politicians, to lobbyists, to people in government-sponsored agencies. But it seems that the financial industry is growing there, and that you find that it's a good place for you to do the kind of work that you're doing. Can you just explain some of the evolution of both the energy space as well as the finance space in DC right now?
Sure, I'll take that. It's actually, I was thrilled when I heard that they're launching in DC because it's actually the right time. 2020 is a pivotal moment. In just the last few years alone, you're seeing a groundswell of action from policymakers to address climate change, but not just from a very specific narrow regulatory perspective, but you have financial regulators that are looking at the importance of climate change and how they can think about that perspective. You also have the financial community that's now under pressure, both from client demand, looking at ESG opportunities and the need for impact and sustainability, but you're also looking at it from the perspective of climate risk. We've already had in this year alone, $10 billion plus disasters in just the first half of 2020. So climate risk is not only a physical risk, it's also a capital risk. And that's becoming much more apparent to a lot of the financial community around the world, in particular in the United States. And so between the policymakers that are here that are looking at this, the financial houses that are seeing the physical risk as well as the financial risk, and then also all the opportunities for technology that's scaling today. We've been through a pretty crazy few months in the markets today, but I think it was BlackRock earlier made an announcement that their sustainable ESG indices have outperformed the rest of the market by over 90%. So, or 90% of those indices have outperformed. So it's actually, it just goes to show that sustainable investing is it's a less volatile opportunity and one that's actually, from a perspective of principal capital, can be quite a profitable one as well.
And that's interesting. Marcelia, I think I'm right to say that ESG has been, there's been a lot of women in the ESG space over the years, but it's not been a very mainstream topic. In fact, it had been in the past much rarer for us to bring folks talking about ESG on Bloomberg TV and into our reporting. That's changing now significantly. And as Melanie said, it's very much in the focus of the news right now. So what does that mean for women in that space and for representation going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll start with the first part of your statement around, the urgency around ESG, especially within the finance business or the private equity business. I think we've certainly seen the emergence of ESG, over the last decade or so, to be incredibly important to investors. Part of that is a demand push from the underlying constituencies at investors, whether they are pension fund beneficiaries, university endowments, students, or the beneficiaries of foundations. You're really starting to see a groundswell of demand for sustainable investing. You're also, seeing an interest in in just the policy perspective of climate change and anything related to ESG. But I think most importantly, you're seeing an emergence of an investable opportunity set within the sustainable space. You're seeing real return generating opportunities that are not for the double bottom line or triple bottom line investors, but for purely financial investors. And so the interest in ESG and sustainability is increasing. We saw it in Europe a decade ago, and you're starting to see more and more, and it will grow I think unseen levels in North America. What that means for women in the space, I think, is a huge opportunity to marry what a lot of women are actually very good at in balancing the quantitative and the qualitative skills that are required in finance and across ESG and client management and all of these other functions. I really think women do a great job of balancing those. And I think ESG roles present a wonderful opportunity to bring both of those skill sets to bear and be very successful at delivering results on both ends.
Thank you for that. Melanie, I think you had an interesting point about the future of the Chief Sustainability Officer.
I think it's great, exactly what Marcelia had mentioned, because you're seeing more and more women taking on leadership roles in ESG, which to me, if I take a little bit more a further outlook on that, what I get really excited about is increasingly, and we're already seeing studies about this, that the next climate officer or the next climate focused officer in companies or investment houses will be the CFO, and that the CFO needs to have sustainability and ESG issues front of mind, which, as Marcelia mentioned, as more and more women take the mantle of ESG positions, they then become the more likely candidate and frankly, the better sought after candidate for those CFO roles and other C-suite positions, all with the macro perspective of, again, elevating women into senior executive positions throughout various parts of the private sector. And so I'm excited to see the mainstreaming of ESG, as Marcelia talked about. I think it's critical, it's important. And now we have the financial data to back up why we need to be thinking about this front of mind. And that's going to lead to some incredible opportunities where the C-suite itself won't have no longer a carve out for an ESG specific role, but everybody in the C-suite should be thinking about this and incorporating that into their investment committee processes. And that also gets this other point about professional diversity. I think there's been a great discussion about variety of diversity initiatives, and professional diversity is also part of that. Looking at the various roles of different people sitting in that investment committee or sitting at that table is really key.
It's interesting. And Marcelia, I wonder just if you could talk a bit about your exposure to the media in the past, perhaps why you weren't as exposed to the media as perhaps you wanted to be or could be, and how that's changed now that you've gotten the media training and I think started more appearances.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'd say my experience with the media is zilch. And this is probably actually my very first real experience with media. I've spoken at conferences and panels, keynote speakers, but speaking to a live audience, as Melanie knows, is very different than speaking to an anchor or through a webinar. And so this is baby steps for me. I'd say in the past, probably as many people experience, not just women, but other, people that are not at the top of the house or in a C-suite position, people that want to, people that are in the C-suite, whether they're the CEO or the president, are the ones that are typically heard at a firm. And then I'd also say, relevant to my role, so often people want to hear from investors. I am not on the investment side. I don't propose that I am an investor at all. But I do have a perspective, one that I think is very important. I speak with the voice of the client, not only inside my firm, but outside my firm. And I think that voice is so incredibly important to have institutional investors heard and their perspectives portrayed across media and otherwise.
Melanie, to just talk a little bit about the importance of representation in new energy, given the dominance of male executives in the traditional energy space, and sort of how you see that impacting the industry going forward.
I think there's really a sweeping change happening. I mean, we're in a moment as a country and as a nation across the board of just taking a harder look at our staffing structures and how we think about diversity across the entire value chain of every company that we invest in, but also as every company we build for that matter as well. And even in politics as well, I think we're really I'm hopeful that 2020 and this year is a real moment where we're seeing a real change in how we approach hiring and how we approach certain decision making. So that's really exciting. I think the other piece, to pick up on Marcelia's point, is that you also are seeing this opportunity here to think about how policymakers and all the different perspectives that people bring to the table into the investing space. So whether you're an investor or you're not an investor, the really important opportunities to think about the role that policy and regulation plays in investment decisions, and thinking about and corporates are doing the same thing as well. So I think it's a real moment right now where we're going to see more and more diverse voices that bring different perspectives that frankly will hopefully strengthen investment decision making going forward and make them more resilient to various shocks that we're going to see going forward.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to just ask one last question, and then we will have to wrap it up. And I'll ask this to both of you. So there's been some talk that since we've seen the protests in the United States and a bigger and important focus on issues of inequality, that investors are looking more at the S than the E. And I think we sort of addressed this in the last panel, but I want to hear both of you talk about, are you seeing that shift away from E in terms of the ESG space? And if not, how are you seeing investors looking at the full picture at this point? Marcelia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my view may be a bit myopic, just given that I'm in such a carbon intense business. And E is certainly one of the focal points of everything that we do. But certainly within the broader investment space, I do think you're starting to see more interest in the S and the G, if not for the communities that you're investing in or around or you're engaging with, particularly with portfolio companies, but also within diversity and inclusion at your own company or within portfolio companies. I think the S and the G can be and should be incorporated into the dialogue, even in an energy firm. I think they're incredibly important, and we will begin to see more and more of this. The ILPA, the International Limited Partner Association, certainly has begun to focus more on the S and the G through their questionnaires that are standard practice across the private equity and private investment space. And as more investors begin to adopt those ILPA questionnaires and send them and push for information and transparency at investment managers and GPs, I think you'll begin to see the underpinnings of more focus on the S and the G going forward across all investor types.
And from the principal perspective, we're actually seeing, I think similarly to Marcelia, which is in her energy firm, as a climate tech focused firm, we're actually seeing incredible focus and continued focus on the climate and the E part. But there's actually a nice, I would say, bleeding of all three of those silos, or rather a breakdown of the walls across the ES and G silos, where you're taking a topic like climate change and showcasing it from not only an environmental perspective, but the social impacts that come from investing in climate technologies, as well as the governance opportunities for investing in those climate technologies. And so we're, already to date, you've got this large corporate demand for companies and businesses for them to acquire, to invest in, to merge with, that are delivering these climate solutions. And our pipeline of opportunities of more and more companies being built that cut across ES and G, all with the goal of solving the global climate challenge, that only is increasing. I think our pipeline continues to grow each year. It's almost doubling in size of the types of companies that are being built to solve for this challenge and to merge into this market. And so I think the policy signals are right, which is there's a vast open ocean for investors and companies to fill it with really exciting climate solutions and technology-enabled businesses. And I think firms like Marcelia and ours are standing ready to take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you both so much. I really look forward to seeing more of both of you on our airways and others going forward. And I just want to say to everyone that if you go to www.bloomberg.com/New Voices, you'll find an application for the New Voices program, and we'll be taking nominations for the New Green Voices through August 10th. So thank you so much. And now I would like to hand it off to my colleague, John Frere, for his interview with Lord Nicholas Stern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Frere. I'm a senior executive editor at Bloomberg News, overseeing our coverage of climate change. With me today is Lord Nicholas Stern. Lord Stern is currently the IG Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics, and he also leads the school's Grantham Research Institute on climate change and environment. And I think, one of the most interesting pieces in the first edition of Green was our piece, How to Grow Green, a really sort of interesting, expansive look at all of the different ways that governments around the world can use this crisis to greenify their economies. It's sort of become a bit of a cliche now in political economy to say never let a good crisis go to waste, but it still holds true in the aftermath of COVID. Now, Lord Stern, you co-authored a report in May, signed, I think, by about 200 policymakers and academics, arguing that support for climate-friendly policies would result in the swiftest economic recoveries around the world as we recover from this terrible COVID economic crash. 2 months on from that, what evidence do you see around the world that policymakers are taking that on board?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. That was a piece in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy with co-authors Cameron Hepburn, Joe Stiglitz, and Brian O'Callaghan, Dimitri Zengelis. And we asked policymakers around the world about their views on what constituted a strong recovery, what constituted a sustainable, green, climate-friendly recovery. And we found that a number of areas, not surprisingly, I think, the answer to that question was you could get both in, for example, retrofitting of buildings, making cities more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians, rolling out your electric vehicle charging stations, and particularly in the natural capital, planting trees, restoring degraded land, including peatlands, looking after water systems and so on. And they had in common not only that they were generating employment and being good to the environment, but that they were fast as well as labor intensive and had strong economic multipliers. So the sustainable story is actually the strong recovery story. And it was remarkable how strongly that was recognized by policymakers around the world.
And so looking at the concrete green stimulus plans that we're now starting to see, we've heard from Germany, France, the UK. Joe Biden, at the end of last week, came up with some of his climate proposals. Which ones do you see as the most promising, as the boldest plans to date? Obviously, we're just at the beginning of this stimulus process. Yeah. Which ones to you look particularly interesting and particularly exciting?
Well, let me turn to that, but it is interesting that they felt that this was the moment to do it, that they felt they got the political space to do it. And if you look at the opinion polls, that is what people want. They want to build back better. They recognize that the old system was very dangerous. And further, they recognize that actually you can make change quickly, because that's one of the things that we've learned from the COVID crisis. So before you sort of go into details of packages, I think it's very important to recognize that the political leaders felt not only they had the space to do it, but also in some sense, they had the political pressure to do it. Now, you've got the green recovery in Europe, which looks really very strong and buttressed by actions in governments. I think this is the first time that Angela Merkel has really been able to tell the German car makers that this is the route we're going, that this is not a moment to rekindle your diesels. This is a moment to push very hard for electric vehicles. The bailout in Air France from the French government was contingent on them pushing very hard to find net zero aviation. Of course, we can find net zero aviation. We have to do that. I think if you look at the package that Rishi Sunak brought in the UK a couple of weeks ago, there was 3 billion for retrofitting buildings. And that's a very important part, making the buildings more efficient. And he also flagged that there'll be more coming for natural capital, working on land and forests and so on. So I think you've seen in Europe quite a strong response. And of course, the United States is its own structure, but you do see, of course, different parts of the United States moving in different directions. And big parts of the United States, of course, are committed to a green growth future and to a green recovery. But I think at best you can say the centre is somewhat confused.
And then,
this is British understatement, John.
Of course. We'll get back to that in a moment. And of course, there's Asia as well. I mean, China, over the last 10 years has tried to position itself as something of a climate warrior. Of course, they've been very big, very strong on solar over the last 10, 15 years ago. But we haven't heard that much from them, at least to date, on green stimulus coming out of this crisis. Is that a surprise to you? Is that a disappointment?
It's a worry. I think that I've been interacting a lot with my Chinese colleagues. I've been working on and in China for 30 years or so, and I'm in close contact with my friends at Tsinghua University, Energy Foundation China, and so on. And there are a lot of people in China pushing very hard for green recovery, pointing out the things we were just discussing, that a lot of the story that from the sustainability list of programs and projects is fast, labor intensive, with strong multipliers. And they see the huge cost reductions in renewables for power, and they see tremendous opportunities in electric vehicles and electrified mobility all the way around. So there's that group of people pushing very strongly. But there's an opposition. The opposition of vested interests in coal, some regions that are very heavily vested in coal, who are pushing back. You've got grid structures which are biased in China against renewables. Still, somewhat bizarrely, they give priority for coal-fired electricity. It makes very little sense, but it's actually a kind of protection mechanism. So we think of vested interests and lobby groups when we discuss the political economy of rich countries. That's there in China too. And that politics is playing its way through. I think we'll learn more as we see the outlines of the 14th five-year plan, 2021-2025. They're going to emerge the latter part of this year. So I think in China, there's a very intense discussion going on. I think there are many people, also quite senior people, who see the real opportunities in the new model of growth, that it's exciting, it's innovative, it's much more attractive, cities where you can move and breathe, ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. They see it and they push it, but we don't yet know which way it's going to fall because the vested interests are quite strong the other way.
China, of course, is always a very, very difficult country to read, very difficult to read its politics. For people watching here, you're clearly, in close contact with colleagues in China. You're obviously a deep expert on this matter. Are there particular policy areas, policy initiatives we should be looking out for to give us a sign of where the pendulum will sort of settle when it comes to the China climate debate?
I think it's the future of coal. China's coal came more or less to a plateau around 2014. And in optimistic mode, we thought it might have a plateau and then tip on downwards. But it's been a plateau that's bounced around, sometimes up, sometimes down. Last year or two, it's been a slight upward tick. And I think it's the plans for coal that are going to be the critical test of whether China is really going to push very strongly. If we see coal start to turn down during this plan, we could see China's emissions peak during this plan. That means between 2021 and 2025. China declared in Paris, in the Paris Agreement of 2015, COP21, that it would peak emissions by 2030. If China says we'll peak emissions during this planned period, that would mean they're peaking them by 2025. And that would be the most important signal. And it would mean coal turning down pretty quickly. As I say, it's plateaued, but what we need to see is that to turn down. And it would be greatly in China's self-interest to do exactly that.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Turning back to the US, and you mentioned earlier that it's interesting in Europe, political leaders felt like they had the cover, they had the broad social support to come out with these ambitious green stimulus plans. Obviously, the US is in a very different sort of part of the debate trajectory, so to speak. Where do you feel the US is on that? Can you imagine a future in which the US gets to the point where Europe is now, or should our ambitions or hopes for green stimulus in the US be much more restrained than that?
Well, for those of us who are not from the United States, but who love the United States, one of the things we love is how varied it is. So there are lots of bits of the United States, and many of its firms are pushing very strongly in a green direction. Even some of its power companies pushing very strongly. You know, things like Duke are pushing in a green direction. California is strong. Much of New England is strong. Many of the firms, as I said, a lot of the data-oriented firms pushing very strongly. The second optimistic part of the US story is the extraordinary creativity. I mean, the electric vehicle was given new life, and very powerful new life, in large measure by Tesla. And that has helped change the world on electric vehicles. Every major car company in the world has declared the end of the era of the internal combustion engine and are working towards it. Different dates, different ways, but Tesla was very important in that. A tremendous amount of the story of the green growth and sustainable growth, with all the opportunities that it carries, is around digital management of systems, of power systems, so that you get a much better, more flexible matching of supply and demand, that you can manage your variable renewables more subtly and efficiently. That's going to be digital management, AI kinds of systems that manage that. Our cities are complicated systems, and we need to get them much more cycle-oriented, pedestrian-oriented, more attractive to autonomous vehicles, and so on. That will be digital management story. Much of land use as well that applies to. So what you've got then is a country with enormous technical prowess in many of the key technologies that matter. And I think that that will be a very powerful driving force as well. And of course, you've got a country with coming now already with the United States, a great deal of unemployment. So are you going to try to get people back to work in the jobs of the 19th and 20th century, in secure jobs, jobs that if their assets are stranded, so too will the jobs? Or are you going to look for the jobs of the 21st century? And I think when push comes to shove, the United States will be looking forward, not looking backwards. That does, of course, depend quite a bit, not totally, but quite a bit on what happens in the elections just a few months away.
Can you imagine, though, a future in which, you know, we see the Europeans are doing this now? Can you imagine a future in which the argument for green stimulus is so compelling that the next Republican candidate, whoever that might be, whether that's in 4 years' time or whatever, well, definitely in 4 years' time, that even the Republican Party, leadership of the Republican Party will embrace it? Is that an inconceivable thought?
Yes, I think that is perfectly feasible. And one thing that we do know is that the Republican candidate for the presidency 4 years from now will not be Donald Trump. You have a constitution. So what would that Republican think? I think the evidence in 4 years' time will be even more compelling than the evidence is now, which is pretty compelling now, that the alternative method of growing, the sustainable method of growing, is much more attractive. You know, the costs of renewable power are going on down. the cost of storage is going on down. In India, the most recent auction had round-the-clock solar. That's solar plus storage, outcompeting all the fossil fuels without subsidy, without carbon tax. That's just going to go on going. And actually, a lot of the story and the creativity will come from the United States. So I think 4 years from now, the campaign will be set in a context where it's just much more efficient, much more attractive to do it clean. And so my guess is that it will be an issue which may not divide the parties. I mean, if you look back over the years, it's very rare that climate has divided the parties in the United States presidential election. And I think that 4 years from now, the evidence will be so powerful that this is a statement of hope, but I think with some justified optimism that the evidence will have changed so dramatically that with a bit of luck, that Republican candidate would see it.
Well, I'd like to close on a note of hope. I know you need to run in a moment, but I have one more question for you. You know, as I said earlier, the audience watching this, there's activists, there's people interested in the broader climate story, but of course, Bloomberg's audience is an audience of entrepreneurs and investors as well. The green technologies are advancing all the time. So we're constantly reading about new developments. If I were to give you $10 million to invest in a green technology of the future, what would it be? What to you holds the most promise right now?
Well, that's very kind of you, John. You can give it to me anyway. But we have to look beyond the renewables now, because we can see where they're going, and they've done tremendously well. They'll go on doing tremendously well. That's more an investment story now. So I would look beyond that to the more difficult parts of the story. More difficult parts of the story, particularly around sea and air transport. Those have to change, and of course, a lot of industrial processes have to change. And there, I think hydrogen and ammonia are going to be important in certainly in sea travel and industrial processes. Heating homes, also hydrogen likely to be important. So getting that green hydrogen through electrolysis, getting that cost right down is enormously important. Every schoolgirl and boy knows that water is H2O. Well, go in there and split off the H2 from the O, and that's where you'll get your hydrogen. And that is going to be enormously important. And if you do it through clean electricity as the energy you need in that process, that I think could be enormously exciting. We've got to bring the costs right down, and we need good technologies to do that. I also think that synthetic air fuels or air fuels from waste. At the moment, air fuels from waste of various kinds, be it food waste or waste from or process waste or waste from crops, as they're processed. Those kinds of opportunities are really moving strongly, but we've got to get the costs right down, because I don't believe that we'll stop air travel. For a while, it should be more expensive because it's so polluting. But basically, it won't go away, and many of us would not want it to go away in over the medium term. And that means you've got to go to zero carbon fuels. We can see those, but we need a lot of effort to bring those down. And I think air capture also is going to be an important part of the process. And by the way, you use air capture to make synthetic jet fuels. So that would be useful for that as well. And never forget natural capital. We always go for the sort of the high tech, the new whizzes. Storage will be very important in all that. But trees are pretty good. Restoring degraded land is pretty good, and they give you all sorts of benefits beyond simply the capture of carbon. So organizing that much better, I think, is enormously important as well. And I always refuse to give a one-shot answer, because this is not a problem with a one-shot answer.
Well, maybe we should be offering you $100 million to invest rather than just 10, because there's so many ideas there. But Laura Stern, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you, John.
Thank you so much for joining us today at our last session of Bloomberg Green, The Time Is Now. My name is Emily Chasen. I'm the Sustainable Finance Editor at Bloomberg Green, and I'm delighted to be joined today by former U.S. Vice President Al Gore, who's also the Chairman of Generation Investment Management. Bloomberg Green has been a huge initiative for us this year here at Bloomberg, a huge change in climate journalism to have a climate change magazine. A lot of people don't know about you that you started off as a journalist yourself. I'm curious, with your years of experience in the climate crisis, how is climate journalism playing a role now?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. But first of all, Emily, let me say congratulations on Bloomberg Green to you and all of your colleagues. It's an extremely important launch, and I'm going to be a regular reader. You can count on that. And luckily, I think more and more people are searching out the kind of news that you are providing. Yeah, I was a reporter for 5 years. When I came back from the Army in Vietnam, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I got offered a job, $95 a week. It's hard to imagine that kind of salary these days, for me anyway. But I had a fantastic mentor, John Sigenthaler, who was editor of the Nashville Tennessean at that time. Really a legendary guy, and I loved journalism. I did all kinds, and in any case, I've maybe paid a little more careful attention to the emergence of climate journalism than I might have otherwise, except for those 5 years of experience as a young cub reporter, you might say. And I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts. One of my classmates when I was an undergraduate went on to become dean of Yale Law School, Robert Post, a very smart guy. And he had a phrase recently. He said that we're witnessing an attack on the authority of knowledge. And I love that phrase. I wrote a book back in 2007 called The Assault on Reason, and covered some of the same themes. One thing that has been a problem, or was a problem for a while, is what's referred to as both sidesism. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about Bloomberg Green is that it is a significant step in the creation of a core body of expertise, so that the journalists who are dedicated to this don't have to rely on lazy formulae like both sidesism. You know, it is a complicated subject, of course, as you know extremely well. And so an easy shortcut in the past was, well, so-and-so says this, but then so-and-so over here says the opposite, and we don't know, you figure it out. I think we're coming out of that for the most part. One other thought, I've written in the past that the free press is supposed to function as a kind of immune system for democracy. And not to torture the metaphor, but there has been kind of an autoimmune disease with attacks on the free press, with the phrase fake news and similar phrases intended to undermine the authority of knowledge. And just recently, this movement of reporting data about the pandemic away from the Centers of Disease Control toward political appointees, that I think that should have created maybe a little bit more of an uproar than it did. But overall, I think that the climate journalists of today that led to the resignation of Scott Pruitt and Ryan Zinke, and the quick discovery of a lot of these attempted rollbacks of climate and environmental laws. So I think that we're seeing the start of a golden era for climate journalism, and I think this launch is very much a part of it.
That's great to hear. You know, it's so interesting to think about how this space has evolved. I'm a sustainable finance editor at Bloomberg. I've been following from the sort of the infancy of data and information in the space to today. Just this past week, you guys announced this new climate trace initiative, and to really have to fill in the gaps, right, with this information that's really been incomplete. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. It's going back to our journalism theme. It's sort of this trust but verify idea, as a lot of the companies just sort of report this information.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about it. We had the launch of this new climate trace initiative on Wednesday, kind of a soft launch because it's a work in progress, but we have enough validation now to have a very high degree of confidence that it is going to work. A guy named Gavin McCormick is the CEO of a company called Wattime, and he is he's the head of one of 9 tech firms and organizations that I've partnered with for 13 months now. And the key technology breakthrough is in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what this now makes possible is to crunch the numbers from dozens of different streams of data to derive an accurate emissions number for every significant man-made greenhouse gas emissions on the entire planet. That sounds like a very ambitious goal, but it's now possible to do with multiple existing satellite systems, ground-based sensors, sea-based sensors. In some geographies, we'll be able to fly drones to fine-tune the algorithms and perfect them. Just since the announcement on Wednesday, we've had a huge number of new organizations reaching out to us to offer their data and some their AI expertise, which may also be helpful. We've got a good core of experts there, but I think that it's extremely exciting because there's been no actionable data on the emissions. To draw a quick analogy, in contacted tracing for COVID-19, if the positive test is 2 weeks old before they start trying to trace the contacts, it's useless. You can't really do anything effective with it. Similarly, the emissions data is usually a year old or 6 months old. It's self-reported. It's not considered as accurate as it should be. Back before the Paris conference, China suddenly fessed up that their emissions were 17% higher than the world had thought. Good that they disclosed it. I appreciate Xi Jinping, their lead guy, then doing that. But within about 6 months, we will have a hard launch, and by next June, we will have our first comprehensive report of every significant source of emissions, who's responsible for what, when, how much, at what rates, and then the data will be updated every 6 hours. This data will be actionable. It will be actionable for governments, some of whom don't really have good data on what emissions are coming in their territory, and many of whom really want that data and want to be able to act on it. There are a lot of companies who want to be able to verify what they're pledging to do, and others who want to not have to worry that competitors will cut corners and steal a march somehow. There are lots of NGOs and activist groups who want to know who's doing what. And Generation Investment Management is already leading the formation of an investor coalition to make the data actionable in markets and in the investment space, so that pensions and asset managers who want to respond to their clients' demands that they invest more in solutions to the climate crisis and divest from bad actors that are making it worse, will have a much more accurate, well, for the first time, really have an accurate indication of who's doing what. So we're very excited about it. It's kind of a massively distributed body cam for the Earth. We will be able to provide very accurate, very timely information.
It's really interesting because there's been a lot more real-time focus on emissions in this COVID-19 era when everything sort of stopped and you could sort of see the nitrous oxide leave the cities and to see the pollution disappear. And I think you've been saying it's almost hard to see the emissions in the sky, right? You can't see what we're doing. It's just an open sewer. So how do you think this can change things going forward?
I think it can and will create an entirely new reality. CO2 is invisible, tasteless, and odorless. And so it's been very hard to track. Methane is somewhat easier to track when you have the instruments built for it. There are some satellites now that can do spot reporting, and they don't have the periodicity of coverage, but that will come as well. But as I said, we're going to blend together and crunch the numbers of dozens of different data streams that will. Let me give you one example. One of our coalition members was set up to track illegal fishing in all the oceans of the world. And they realized that the instruments and the data collection resources they have make it possible for them to track the CO2 emissions of the ships that they're following and all the ships they come in contact with. So they're part of that coalition. And so, well, let me use an example from the Black Lives Matter movement. After the horrendous murder of George Floyd, somebody asked in the media, are these kinds of horrible incidents becoming more common? And the answer was, no, they're just on videotape for the first time. And that has changed a lot. And now one of these incidents occurs. It's not all that uncommon to have 4 or 5 different iPhone bystander videos and security cam footage from the nearby buildings and the body cam footage after a delay from the police. You put it all together as almost a mini documentary 48 hours after the tragedy. And sometimes police officers are properly exonerated. But more often, tragically, it reveals for all of us the tragedy that has gone ignored and unprotested for so long. And now it's kind of thrilling in a way to have these mass marches where the vast majority of the people are white, opening their minds and hearts for the first time to actually realize what's been going on. And I think the same kind of awakening is going to follow with the full disclosure of constant streams of accurate data on why the climate crisis is getting worse, where the causes are coming from, who is responsible. And you're going to see that data made actionable immediately.
Yeah, I guess that's a really interesting view of the future and where this could go. And I guess real-time information, as we've seen at Bloomberg for a long time, is so important in helping people make decisions about their lives. I wanted to ask about COVID a little bit. The past few months have been probably not what anybody expected for 2020. And at Generation, you guys have one of the oldest sustainable investment shops with over about 20 billion under management. And you've been sort of looking out at this sustainability future and road mapping it for years. So now that COVID has hit, is it an accelerant to some of those trends that you've been seeing, or is it a distraction?
We think the evidence is now very clear that it's actually accelerating the sustainability revolution and accelerating the transition to renewable energy, electric mobility, the retrofitting of buildings to save money. It pays for itself. Lots of businesses and industries are really trying to move very quickly. And I think the pandemic has actually accelerated this. Last week, Generation released our 4th annual Sustainability Trends Report. And thank you, by the way, for Bloomberg covering that. Thank you. And one of our findings was that this is definitely accelerating this transition. We think the world is in the early stages of what we call the sustainability revolution, which is based on new digital tools like artificial intelligence and machine learning that we're using in Climate Trace. By the way, TRACE stands for Tracking Real-Time Atmospheric Carbon Emissions. And it's giving a lot of executive teams the ability to manipulate and manage protons and electrons and atoms and molecules and genes, and with the same precision that the IT companies have long demonstrated in managing bits of information. And we think it has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And there's so many examples. And the pandemic, as horrible as it is, has stimulated, as some tragedies in history do, a new way of thinking, a new awakening, if you will. And by the way, the overlay between the pandemic and the climate crisis is also capturing a lot of attention. We see now that the burning of fossil fuels is a precondition for higher death rates and higher infection rates from COVID-19. China completed a massive study of 324 cities that correlated precisely the amount of carbon fuel related air pollution city by city and the infection rate from COVID-19, the seriousness of the cases and the death rate. Harvard School of Public Health published a study earlier this year showing the same linear correlation in US cities. And 18 months ago, there was a very big study going back to look at the flu pandemic of 1918-19 and matching it with the amount of coal burning in American cities. And it correlated precisely with a 10% increased mortality rate from that flu, with even a moderate increase in the pollution from burning coal and an 11% increase in infant mortality. So, you know, there are two similarities between the pandemic and the climate crisis. One is both show us that when the scientists are setting their hair on fire, so to speak, and trying to warn us in ways that'll get our attention, it's best not to ignore them. The best epidemiologists and virologists have been warning us of a pandemic almost exactly like the one we're now struggling to conquer. And the climate scientists, of course, for even longer have been trying to warn us of what the science is telling us about this existential threat to the future of human civilization. The other similarity, Emily, is that both of them have revealed in stark relief the pre-existing injustices and inequalities suffered by Black Americans and other communities of color, indigenous peoples, Latinx peoples. The highest infection rate from COVID-19 is in the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona. And the death rate and infection rate for Black Americans is so much higher. It is just horrific that the majority of Americans, and I include myself in this indictment, have been so long unaware to an actionable degree of what this means. The net worth of the average Black family and the average white family compare as follows. It takes 11 and a half Black families to match the net worth of one white family. And that hasn't changed in 50 years. It's horrific. So I think that, and I think these overlapping awakenings, that's a clunky phrase, but I think that's what we're equipped with here, are actually supporting one another. The LGBTQ gains, which came earlier, are being consolidated. The recent Supreme Court decision proves it. The gender equity gains of the last few years are being consolidated. They're not going away. And the awakening about the dire need and the urgency of addressing the inequality, less access to health care, less access to Zoomable jobs, to good housing, et cetera, for communities of color, that has to be addressed now. And people are determined to make these concerns the heart of the movement to build back better, to have a so-called Great Reset.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you've been talking about this idea of sustainable capitalism for a long time. Is that more a thing now than it was before? Where are you in the journey, do you think, of getting towards sustainable capitalism?
Well, yes, thank you for asking. Yes, Generation was founded 16 years ago. We've been managing assets for 15 years. And during that time, there have been some dramatic changes. First of all, there has been voluminous academic research now proving that in almost every sector of the global economy, those businesses fully integrating ESG factors into their business plans are more profitable than their peers that do not. And when it's done correctly, asset managers fully integrating ESG are getting better returns. I'm knocking on wood there because we play a role in that, but it's across the board. And so one old accusation against managers using ESG has now been turned on its head. You used to hear some other managers saying, well, if you use ESG, you may be violating your fiduciary responsibility to your clients. Well, now that the evidence shows clearly it's best practice, those managers and pension funds that do not fully integrate ESG are at very high risk of violating their fiduciary responsibility because they're leaving money on the table if for some misguided ideological legacy bias, they say, oh, we're not going to deal with that. They're not doing the kind of job for their clients that now equals best practice. And of course, the other changes have come partly because there's a growing awareness of how serious this crisis is and how we all have to reorganize our operations and the design of our civilization, really. And the good news is, of course, the cost of renewable electricity, electric vehicles, batteries, retrofits, regenerative agriculture, circular manufacturing, forestry and ocean management, all of these things have been getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're now so competitive that last year, for example, if you look at all of the new electricity generation capacity installed worldwide, 80% of it was renewable. We're seeing the validation of the wisdom articulated by one of the Saudi oil ministers decades ago when he told the king, you better remember the Stone Age didn't end because of a shortage of stones. It ended because something better came along, and something better's come along now. And the sustainability revolution is bringing that new reality into every sector of the global economy.
That is such a good point, that especially looking at all these sort of exogenous shocks that we've had into the market and into finance the past few months, that this has really revealed quite a bit about what underpins capitalism and what the future could look like. I wanted to ask you just to wrap up a little bit about policy. There's a lot of really interesting government policy coming out around the world, in Europe and the US, on climate right now, on green stimulus. What do you think really needs to happen there, and what's going to make a difference, and what are you seeing that is inspiring you about the future and policy?
Well, I'm quite encouraged that in many countries, the so-called recovery plans are now being shaped as green recovery plans. This is partly because we have crossed a threshold beyond which it's ever clearer that the sustainability technologies, like the ones I mentioned a moment ago, are cheaper and better, and they don't have the co-pollution like so-called conventional air pollution, mostly from burning fossil fuels, that kills 9 million people a year, even before you factor in these elevated death rates from COVID-19 that comes to people that breathe in more pollution. I don't want to get into any of the political dialogues that are also woven into this, Emily, but one of the leading candidates for president just put out a climate plan that I think is pretty impressive, and most people who share my opinions agree with that, and I think there will be a clear contrast on the ballot in the U.S. In the European Union, the recovery plan there is very green. Now, China, we're going to have to wait and see because they're the first economy to come back after the pandemic to the extent that they have, and emissions, as predicted, have gone back up again. But I'm hopeful that overall the world economy is going to make this recovery a green recovery and a jobs-intensive recovery. And that's another reason why this is being done. The Oxford study that Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, who spoke on your program, and others just put out, shows that for each dollar or euro spent in a recovery, there are 3 times as many jobs created if it's a green investment. Here in the U.S., for the last 5 years, solar installer has been by far the fastest growing job, 5 times faster job growth than average job growth. Second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. We have to have a just transition. We have to make sure that coal miners, for example, who it's not their fault that the climate crisis emerged. We owe them gratitude for what they have done for so long to help build up the civilization we have. They deserve better jobs with good pay, and there are many other examples. But I'm encouraged that we're going to see a green recovery.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Al. It was great to hear your thoughts, wide-ranging, and to sort of unpack that speed of the digital transition and the sustainability revolution that you're seeing. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us at Bloomberg Green today.
Thank you for inviting me, Emily, and to you and all your colleagues. Once again, congratulations on the launch of Bloomberg Green. I'm very excited about it.
Hello again. I'm Aaron Rutkoff. I'm the editor of Bloomberg Green, and I just want to say thank you to the Vice President. What a privilege it was to have so much of his time and his thoughts today. And thank you to all of our guests who participated in this, our first live event. Really glad we had the chance to have such thoughtful and interesting conversations. And I'm really glad for all of you out there who chose to spend time with us today. It really means a lot. I also want to continue to be grateful and thank our sponsors, HP, JLL, and Iberdrola, for making this event possible today. I want to remind everybody, hopefully if you found our event, you're already a subscriber to the Bloomberg Green daily newsletter. But if not, please go to bloomberggreen.com and sign up. You receive a post each day by our staff writers and columnists, and it's a really great read, I think. I'd also encourage you to follow Bloomberg Green on Twitter. We are the @climate Twitter handle, and you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. So this was our first virtual event. We are planning a second one in mid-September, from September 14th to 18th. It's going to be bigger than this one. It's 4 days. It's the Bloomberg Green Festival. You can go to bloomberglive.com for updates. Right around that same time, we'll be putting the finishing touches on the second print issue of the magazine that goes along with everything else that we do. I'm really, really excited for the stuff we're working on, and I hope those of you who joined us today will both be back for our next event and will check out the second print issue of Bloomberg Green. So again, thank you so much. See you all in September and online, and thank you.